So I started this body of work probably about a year and a half ago, where I was making studies based on this image that kept coming up in a dream in the morning. I was seeing this animal skeleton with a faceted stone in its stomach, and so I started to do a bit more research when I was overseas in the natural history museums all over Europe and the USA, where I was looking into the different stories and connections between dead things and precious objects, and specifically bones and precious stones. I was looking at the contrast in the material feel and opacity of chalkiness that you see in a bone when you're using it on paper or depicting it on paper, next to faceted stones that seem to contain, in a way, water or light, and the way that they then refract and disperse light and sparkle. So I started to look into literature and read pretty widely into human history and how we look at these two objects, and how overall we tend to bring ourselves to them with a sense of emotion, and we animate these objects quite a bit. So it is difficult to look at a skeleton without imagining the life that was previously attached to it, in the same way that with gemstones we tend to either project into them our own stories or feel like they contain previous other people's stories of previous owners. The work Golden in the exhibition, the title refers to a short story called The Golden Anaconda, and there is a passage in the story about an indigenous group of people in South America. They mummify the skulls of their dead and put rubies and garnets and other gemstones in the eye socket of the skull and hang them from trees in a sacred forest to represent both fruit and a sacred place for their dead ancestors to be within the landscape. And I thought that was a really evocative kind of idea. So I've played with the idea of placing gemstones inside the skulls of, they're not humans, they're evolutionary stages between ape and human. And in a way, the light in the gemstone animates the skull because it looks as if one or two of them are blinking or winking. Other works in the exhibition, there is one called Bird on Rock, which is a bit of a play on the 1956 Tiffany's famous gemstone brooch called Bird on Rock. So I'm looking a little about the preciousness of these objects and how they become part of our life and our kind of popular culture, but also how the contrast in lightness and weight can happen inside in the work itself, with the incredibly light skeleton of a bird amassed on top of this very heavy, very significant stone. Another work, Millennium Star, I was specifically looking at the way that light is both contained and then projected out of a very large stone. I was lucky enough to see some of the world's largest diamonds and see what they do to light, and it's very much a process of materialising that light for us to see and splitting the light as if it's this deck of cards, so that we're projected as a viewer from one viewpoint, the spectrum split into spatial relationships with each other. So I did a few light maps where I would look at the stones and make sketches not so much of its form, but of the proportion of yellow to green, for example, or blue, in the way that the light was projected back to us in our space. So I approached this body of work on a much more intuitive level than I have in the past with some of my previous work, and I really allowed this image that occurred in a dream of mine to structure and drive my research for a period of time. But I think that after putting the exhibition together, what was extremely important to me is the material choice of watercolour to represent something which is, I think, materially similar to the way that pigments move through water, and that is the way that the passage of light moves through stone. And this tends to be a pretty important idea that I carry through my whole work, whereas the material substance and the processes that you apply to them as an artist contain some of the meaning of the work and actually do something to the viewer. And in this body of work, what I'm interested in is the way that the changing viewpoints a viewer takes when they're looking at the object of a precious stone is in some way related to the changing viewpoints they might take when looking at a depiction of that precious stone, because when I get it right, it seems to contain light itself, the painting. And in a bigger sense, my practice tends to always be interested in this relationship between the process that the artist might take upon the artwork, but also that impact, the physical impact upon the viewer, and how they might then relate to the artwork overall.